When we think about racism, we usually picture the obvious stuff, right? Overt, explicit prejudice. But what about the racism we can't easily see? Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving deep into the often unseen societal structures that literally shape our world. Researchers and sociologists point to a reality that's way more complex and deeply embedded in the everyday systems we navigate. We're going to focus entirely on systemic racism today, what it actually is, where it comes from, and how it impacts absolutely everything, from the house you live in to your very biology. This brings up a pretty massive question posed by researchers regarding the shift from overt prejudice to deeply hidden modern inequalities. Basically, how do we make the invisible visible? Over the years, social scientists have noticed that racism in American society has heavily shifted away from those overt acts and messages to much more subtle, implicit expressions. Today, these manifestations are baked right into nearly all aspects of society. And because they operate so quietly, they're often totally invisible to anyone who isn't a direct victim. So to see what's hidden, we actually have to look really closely at the structures themselves. Which brings us to Section 1, the tip of the iceberg. To help us wrap our heads around this concept, public health researchers Gilbert Gee and Annie Rode suggest we visualize society as a massive iceberg. It's a brilliant way to illustrate a really stark comparison. The tip, the part sticking out of the water, represents overt racism. We're talking explicit hate crimes, blatant discrimination, racial slurs. It's highly visible, you can't miss it. But that much larger base, the part submerged completely underwater, that represents systemic and structural racism. This huge base is made up of unseen societal systems, laws, and norms that expose people of color to health-harming conditions and build up barriers to opportunities. And according to the research, it's actually the more dangerous part precisely because it operates entirely out of sight. Moving to Section 2, beneath the surface. Let's travel beneath that waterline to examine exactly what makes up that massive, hidden base of our societal iceberg. So the absolutely crucial point experts make here is that systemic racism isn't really about individual conscious acts of bias. Instead, it involves whole systems. We're talking the political, legal, economic, healthcare, and criminal justice institutions. The whole shebang. It refers to established beliefs and entrenched practices that condone and perpetuate widespread unfair treatment of people of color. It's so deeply embedded in how things operate that it often just goes completely unquestioned. Actually, a lot of people just assume it reflects the natural order of things. And that leads us directly to structural racism. Think of this as the actual scaffolding holding those unfair systems up. While systemic racism looks at the big picture of inequality, structural racism zooms in on the specific mechanisms, the concrete laws, the institutional practices, and those unwritten policies that form the framework. It's the engine that produces inherited disadvantage for minoritized groups and, on the flip side, inherited advantage for majority groups. Okay, Section 3, History and Codification. To really understand how this scaffolding was constructed in the first place, we need to trace the historical blueprints documented by sociologists and historians. Historians trace a very clear progression for this scaffolding. It starts way back in the 17th century with the invention of the biological race myth. Leading philosophers and scientists at the time basically falsely claimed there were genetically distinct human races. It was a completely pseudoscientific concept, fabricated specifically to justify and codify the system of slavery. Fast forward to the 1870s through the 1960s, and that scaffolding was heavily reinforced by Jim Crow laws, which were deliberately designed to restrict the rights of Black Americans by segregating everything, from schools to hospitals. Then we hit 1968 when the Fair Housing Act outlawed explicit discrimination. But as we're going to see, simply changing the law didn't magically erase the scaffolding. Even after landmark civil rights legislation was passed, these deeply rooted systems became self-perpetuating. They operate silently today. Once a system like residential segregation is set in place by deliberate acts of the past, it just creates a lasting cycle. For example, think about historical redlining. This was a government and banking practice that outright denied mortgages and loans to minority neighborhoods. Decades later, those formerly redlined neighborhoods continue to suffer from lower property values. And because public schools rely heavily on local property taxes, students in those areas receive fewer resources. That impacts their future economic opportunities, which in turn impacts their ability to build wealth. The system basically runs on autopilot. Section 4, Real-World Impacts. So how do we connect this abstract historical scaffolding to concrete modern-day realities? Well, these invisible structures manifest physically across a bunch of different sectors.
In housing, historical redlining directly translates to today's massive generational wealth gaps and highly segregated neighborhoods. In education, punitive disciplinary norms lead to minoritized students being suspended or expelled at way higher rates for minor behavioral issues, stuff that usually just warrants counseling. That directly creates the school-to-prison pipeline. And in the environmental sector, decades of systemic disinvestment in infrastructure and just ignoring community concerns led directly to the 2014 Flint, Michigan water crisis, where the city changed its water source just to cut costs, resulting in widespread lead poisoning.
And this brings us to some pretty profound impacts on human biology. Research published in the journal Health Affairs really highlights how these social determinants directly damage our health. The research is absolutely clear here. Racism is not always conscious, but it has severe, undeniable adverse health consequences. Because of residential segregation, people of color are way more likely to live in neighborhoods with concentrated disadvantage, and that heavily restricts access to health-promoting resources. Decades of research confirm that this inherited disadvantage creates a direct causal pathway to higher rates of chronic illness and a lower life expectancy. Systemic racism harms health through a few compounding avenues. First off, there's the chronic stress associated with financial strain and just navigating race-based unfair treatment day in and day out. Second, economic disadvantage directly increases exposure to environmental hazards, like poor air quality and toxic waste. Third, there is a pervasive systemic lack of access to quality medical care. And finally, biased policing not only results in direct physical harm, but it inflicts deep, lasting community trauma. Section 5. Dismantling the system. Because systemic racism permeates literally all sectors, experts emphasize that dismantling it requires mutually reinforcing actions across the board. Quick, piecemeal solutions, they simply don't work against a self-perpetuating system. To actually address this, the sources outline a very clear multi-step approach. It begins with the strict enforcement of current civil rights laws. Why? Because written policies mean absolutely nothing if unwritten norms are just allowed to override them. But of course, that's not enough. Step 2 requires passing new legislation, particularly to protect voting rights and prevent suppression, ensuring equal political representation. This has to be paired with Step 3, sustained advocacy by civil society organizations to keep equity firmly on the agenda. And finally, Step 4 calls for truth and reconciliation. This is a healing-centered approach that involves openly acknowledging historical injustices, teaching the accurate history of racism, and truly committing to repairing the damages caused over centuries. As we wrap up this explainer, I want you to sit with this thought from sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva. He points out that the systems creating inequity today aren't loud, they are quiet. They're totally embedded in the normal operations of our institutions. So if the absolute greatest barrier to equality is its invisibility, what steps can you take to see the unseen systems operating right around you? Thanks for joining us today, and keep questioning those structures beneath the surface.